chapter 2, what I'd like to do now is talk about three key parts of the chapter. And we're going to discuss the naive expectations of the invaders. Then we're going to get into Colonel Lancer and a few more important details that we learn about him. And then finally, the key part of chapter 2, the most important scene probably, was the death of Captain Bentic at the very end. And we'll discuss the implications of what that might mean. So to discuss all three things, we're actually going to go to the text itself. Let me pull up my version of chapter 2, here PDF, and I'm going to start actually on page 22. So on page 22, we begin this conversation about these soldiers and their expectations for war. So let me grab my highlighter tool, and I want you to see the way that these soldiers have been trained to think about war so far. The very bottom of page 22, it says, their war so far had been play. Fine weapons and fine planning against unarmed, planless enemies. They had no lost fights and suffered little hurt. So for these men, this war has not been difficult. It's not been hard. They haven't seen any of the realities of warfare that we often think of. And what that's led them to is very similar to the townspeople, almost in a parallel to the townspeople from chapter 1, this naive attitude about what war really means. Just like we saw the townspeople trying to welcome these invaders like they would a house party guest, we see the same thing here in chapter 2 with the invaders. They don't understand. Chapter 2 continues on to page 25, where Captain Bentic doesn't want to wear his helmet. We know that's a problem for him later in the chapter, but he does so because there hasn't been any trouble, right? There hasn't been any problems so far, and you can see that in this conversation between him and Hunter and Loft, right? These people are harmless enough. They seem to be good, obedient people, right? They're not causing any problems, right? Everything's going to be fine. That idea continues on page 28, right? Where, again, the townspeople are described as being very calm and sensible, right? The people are calm and sensible, harmless. And George Carrel, now he's the one who was the mole who helped prepare the town for invasion. He further reinforces that idea when he's discussing with Colonel Lancer that these aren't fierce people. They haven't had a war for 100 years. They've forgotten about fighting. So that's point one I want you to understand, that the invaders have a very naive view of war, but also these townspeople. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Colonel Lancer, because he is one of the main characters, obviously, of this story, and as the commanding officer, he gives us a great perspective of what warfare really is for these soldiers. So on 23, we hear more about Lancer's background. He had been in Belgium and France 20 years before and tried not to think about what he knew. Now, this is a reference very clearly to World War I, and what Lancer remembers is trench warfare, right? Trench warfare. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of soldiers died in World War I in this brutal, horrific form of fighting. So for him, he remembers war not as this easy game that they're playing, but as torture and killing and sickness and tiredness, right? Weariness, hatreds. That's what Lancer thinks of as war. That's what he experienced as war in World War I. And that has given him this robotic-like view of himself as a soldier. Lancer told himself he was a soldier, given orders to carry out. He was not expected to question or think, but to carry out orders. And he tries to put aside these sick memories, which really would represent his humanity, in order to get the job done. His job is described later on page 33, where he talks about it to George Carrel. My job is to get the coal out. And to do that, I must maintain order and discipline. And to me, this sounds much more like a machine or a robot's perspective than that of a human being. Do your job at all costs. And there doesn't matter what collateral damage gets in the way. Now, I want you to consider this idea of the psychological effects of war on soldiers, because it's a topic we're going to come back to later on in the text. Okay, the last comment I want to make today is from page 37. And on page 37, and it's such a subtle little line here at the very top of the page, we find out that something's happened, right? I have to report, sir, Captain Bentic has been killed. Whoa, all right. Finally, we see a casualty of war on the side of the invaders. And the description of the way this happens is pretty bland, right? A little bit further down on page 37, Captain Loft drew himself up and said, formally, I just relieved Captain Bentic, right? When some trouble about a recalcitrant miner who wanted to quit work, he shouted something about being a free man. Now, we're going to find out a little later, not in chapter 2, but later in the text. This man's name is Alex Morden, and we'll hear more about him in chapters 3 and 4. Ultimately, he wants to be free. And so the way he describes, or the way he shows his freedom, is by putting a pickaxe, like a mining axe, a mining pick, into the head of Captain Bentic. And at this moment, now we understand that war has begun. And the very end of the chapter, Lancer says that very point. So it starts again. We will shoot this man and make 20 new enemies. It is the only thing we know. The only thing we know. So there's going to be a clear response to this death of Captain Bentic. It's going to be to execute the perpetrator of that crime. And then that's going to lead to more enemies being created. But Lancer doesn't suggest that he's going to stop that cycle. He's going to feed into it because that's all we know. And this actually gets us to a point that Lancer predicts on page 35. He says, there are no peaceful people. There are no friendly people. Can't you understand that we are at war with these people? And truly now, the war has started. All right, that's all in terms